We're now going to cross to Manchester to speak to our next guest, who is Rabbi Yossi Chazan, who's been patiently waiting. Rabbi Chazan was born in New York. He studied in Montreal and New York, and he became a Kollel Fellow here in Australia at the Yeshiva Centre in Melbourne. In 1984, he was appointed the Director of Education at the Jewish Cultural Centre, where his reputation grew as a vibrant and an inspiring leader, serving both the immediate North Manchester Jewish community and regionally in the north of England. In 1991, Rabbi Chazan accepted the offer to be the rabbi of the prestigious Holy Law Hebrew congregation, and he works tirelessly. His congregation know him as the rabbi who never sleeps. Together with his wife Mindy and their 12 children, they have created a warm and caring shul. And his extensive knowledge has given him a widening fame within the community. In fact, I believe hundreds and hundreds of men and women from a broad spectrum of North Manchester Jewry attend his weekly classes where he offers his insight and his inspiration. Tonight, Rabbi Chazan will be giving us advice for when we struggle with doubt and uncertainty according to the lessons of Rambam, which is so relevant for right now. So thank you so much for being here.
Good evening. Whenever we complete one of the 5 books of the Torah, the whole community cries out with great gusto and passion, Chazak, Chazak, v'nizchazek. Let us strengthen ourselves and be strengthened. How do we find strength in adversity? The rabbis tell us that those words, Chazak, Chazak, v'nizchazek, have the same numerical value as the words Kihem Chayenu v'Erech Yameinu v'Onega Yemu v'Layla. That we delve and toil in Torah. And therefore it's so appropriate that although we've just entered into 3 weeks of national mourning, we just fasted, the smashing of the 10 Commandments, and especially this year when we're experiencing the ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, and all of humanity the world over is engulfed in an unprecedented crisis. We're able tonight to celebrate a true Simchas Torah, completion of the Rambam, which brings amazing blessings into our lives. Recently, someone showed me a cartoon of a Satmar Chassid living in Williamsburg, New York, and he's kvetching and krechzing and complaining to his mate. For the last few months, I've been homeschooling my children. Reminds me, there was a picture I saw of a liquor store in America, which was kept open during the lockdown because it was deemed to be an essential business. And above the store was a message: if you're homeschooling your children, stock up your supplies here. Anyway, the Satmar Chassid was bemoaning his fate, and his mate tells him, what's the big deal? I know plenty of Lubavitchers who've been homeschooling for years. They live far-flung Jewish communities, away from the center. There's no available Jewish education. And they regularly homeschool. And he thought a moment and he said, now I understand why these Lubavitchers are so desperate for Mashiach. But the truth is, how do we dispel darkness through light? My brother-in-law, maybe people in Melbourne know him, Rabbi Yossi Chazan, has a brother, Yidl, who's a very distinguished Slonim or Chassid. He's not a Lubavitcher. But he's a communal activist, he's a very wise, astute man. He helps people in the community. And he entered into the house of a Baba Verchassid in Borough Park, in Brooklyn. And immediately he notices a huge portrait of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He says, you're a Baba, where do you come to the Lubavitch? And he tells him he has a very large family, he's blessed. All of his children are scholars, devout, except for one daughter who slid off the path, and she was engaged to marry a non-Jew. He consulted great rabbis, rabbis, Rosh Yeshivas, to no avail. And someone whispered in his ear, why don't you go and get a blessing, get advice from the Lubavitcher? How do I do so? Every Sunday morning, the Rebbe distributes dollars. That's an opportune time. He went, stood in line for a few hours, eventually came before the Rebbe, overwrought with emotion. He burst out in tears, told the Rebbe his plight. His daughter is contemplating marrying out. The Rebbe didn't bat an eyelash. With a smile, he gave him $1. bracha v'atzlacha, blessing. Another dollar for your daughter, and another dollar for her boyfriend, fiance. The fellow was shocked, but the line moved. He came home. He told his wife he was drinking in Last Chance Saloon, Only Hope, and the Rebbe didn't give him any advice or blessings. On the contrary, gave $1 for the boyfriend, who was not even Jewish. And both the man and his wife began to cry. There were tears streaming down their cheeks. When suddenly the daughter, their worry, entered the room. She asked them, "Why are you crying?" They told her the truth, that the Rebbe gave $1 for her and her boyfriend. She was over the moon. She was overjoyed. You see, even the Rebbe recognizes the greatness of my boyfriend, my fiancé. She whipped out her mobile phone, called up her friend, told him what happened. There's a great rabbi, a mystic, who's renowned as a miracle worker, a great saint, and he gave $1 for you. And suddenly he says, "You mean after all we've been through together, you still believe in all of this primitive superstition, blessings of righteous people? I don't think we're really cut out for each other." And there and then, he cut off the relationship. And the message I learned from this story is you dispel darkness, not with curses, not with a broomstick, but by spreading light. And therefore the words, Yehi Ar, let there be light, has the same numerical value as Habracha, blessing, which is Gematria, same numerical value as the words Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem. What is the word of Hashem? The Gemara says, Zu Halacha. It refers by studying Halacha. It's also Zaketz, redemption. By studying Halacha, which is epitomized in Rambam, who encompasses all of Jewish teachings, one brings blessings, one brings light into our lives. And the truth is, we have a principle that everything is alluded to in the Torah. And one of the earliest rabbis, Rabbeinu Ephraim, in his biblical commentate, explains, where does the Torah allude to the Rambam? The last verse of the Torah, where the verse says, Ulechol hayada chazaka, which refers to the magnum opus of the Rambam, the Mishnah Torah. Ulechol hamoir hagadol, at least the way it's pronounced, it alludes to the guide to the perplexed the Rambam wrote. Asher asa Moshe le'einei kol Yisrael, which Moshe wrought before the eyes, or he elevated the eyes, the perspective, the vision of Klal Yisrael. Why is the Rambam's works alluded to in the final, ultimate verse of the Torah? You know, one of the early great rabbis is known as the Meiri. And whenever he quotes his predecessors, he has pet names for them. Alfasi, the Rif, is called Gedolei HaPoskim, the greatest of the halachic arbiters. Rashi is Gedolei HaRabbanim, the greatest of rabbis. When he refers to the Rambam, which he does constantly, he calls the Rambam Gedolei HaMechaber, literally the greatest of all authors. Mechaber, Chibur. But the rabbis say this doesn't only allude to the fact that the Rambam was a prolific author. Gedolei HaMechaber, Chibur in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew means to unite, to connect. The Rambam begins his Mishnah Torah with a discussion of godliness, the presence of the Almighty, the Creator. You say that Yesodis, Amud HaChachma, the name of Hashem. And he concludes with the coming of Mashiach. Because the role of the Rambam is to be a mechaber, to attach heaven and earth. Therefore, it's amazing. The Rambam's birth was Erev Pesach. Pesach being a Yom Tov of redemption. His passing from this world was on the 20th of Teves, when we always read the narrative of Shmois, Va'era, again the story of the Exodus. The Rambam stands for Rabbeis Moshe Be'eretz Mitzrayim, all the miracles and wonders which Moshe made in the land of Egypt, where the Rambam resided. In fact, the Rambam was born precisely on the 14th of Nisan, Heya Dalet Alofim Tov Tov Tzadik Dalet, in the year 4894. And the mystics say if you count up the verses from the beginning of the Torah, from Bereshis Bara, and you get to the 4,894th verse, it's Eila Hadvorim Asher Diber Moshe, the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the words which Moshe taught Klal Yisrael, which the Sefer Devorim has a very special resonance to our generation. Everyone knows the famous tune, Rebbe often sang it at Fabrengens, to the words Ani Mamin, that a Jew believes with perfect faith in the coming of a Redeemer, of Mashiach. And this tune actually was composed by a renowned, celebrated Moshe Tzachossid by the name of Razriel David Fastig, as he was taken from the Umschlagplatz in Warsaw in a cattle car, a crowded car, being taken to Treblinka. And he realized there's an ultimate test of faith. And in his mind, he composed this tune, Ani Mamin, sang it softly, it caught on. The whole cattle car, all the Jews on the way to the gas chambers were singing. He took a scrap of paper, he wrote down the musical notes to the tune he had just made, and he said publicly, anyone who will bring this tune to my Rebbe, the Rishol of Mozhitz, I promise him half of my portion in the world to come. One young man got on the shoulders of his mate. He saw a bit of an opening in the roof of the cattle car. He jumped out. His friend did likewise. One was killed instantly. The other miraculously managed to go to Israel, met the Moshe Rebbe's son, Shmuel Eliyahu. They took the musical notes of Ani Mamin as composed in the cattle car to Treblinka, sent it to his father. It suddenly arrived. His father, the Moshe Rebbe, who was in New York at the time, was in the middle of a bris. And when someone sang based on the musical notes, he said when this was sung by this chassid, the pillars of the world trembled. And he said afterwards that with this tune, Jews went to the gas chambers and crematoria. With this tune, we will go to greet Mashiach. And the generation to whom Moshe addresses Dvorim is the previous generation have perished. They're now about to enter into the promised land. And the final verse is connected to the Rambam, because the Rambam is the one who's the Mechaber, who unites heaven and earth, who halacha brings the highest level of divinity, of holiness, into everyday, concrete, mundane actions. And just like when we read that verse, L'chol hayada chazaka, we then celebrate the joy of Simchas Torah. And Simchas Torah is, we read, V'zois habracha shaberach Moshe, which contains all the blessings. So too, when we make a Siyum HaRambam, the heavens open, and we rededicate ourselves, even in times of adversity, where mischazik, we strengthen ourselves in our devotion, our dedication to Torah learning, which is the source of our direction and inspiration in life. And this is especially true in today's day and age. The great mystics, the Kabbalists, tell us a fascinating truth, that there was the generation of the flood, generation of promiscuity, followed by the generation of the Der Hafloga, when they attempted to use science and technology to build a tower to rebel against God. The Arizal tells us that the neshamas, the souls of the generation of the flood and the generation of the Tower of Babel, later were reincarnated. Those were the 600,000 Jews who left Egypt. And therefore they were punished. First, the boys were thrown into the Nile, resembling the flood. They had to work on building these huge structures, like the building of the Tower of Babel. And ultimately, we left Egypt. And had we merited, Mount Sinai would have been our last stop. Moshe would have been the Redeemer. He would have brought us straight from Sinai to Yerushalayim. But we created a golden calf. And therefore, the rabbis say one of the signs that we're ready for redemption is when women will demand equal rights, husbands will listen to wives, then, Mashiach is around the corner. Why? Because when we sinned in the golden calf, only the men built it. The women refused to contribute towards it. One of the signs of today's generation. So on one hand, we were a generation our souls have been through a lot. And the rabbis tell us that just like in Egypt, they left in great haste. They shouldn't fall and descend into the 50th level of impurity. Before Mashiach comes, Jews will fall into this 50th level, lack of faith, lack of purity and holiness. And yet, one of the great Rebbes, the Yisrael of Apt, once said, the neshamis, the people before Mashiach will be gore. He made 10 times with his hand. Gore, gore, gore. Exceedingly, very, very, a lowly generation. But I promise you that the Almighty never had greater pleasure than this generation attempting to serve Hashem. And as the Mittler Rebbe brings, that when Moshe Rabbeinu saw the future, and when he came to our generation, and he saw all the trials and tribulations we face on every level, he then became the humblest of human beings on the face of earth. And on a deeper level, our generation, being that we had witnessed, we had experienced the Exodus, the splitting of the sea, the revelation at Sinai, our generation in potentia has levels that no other generation could reach. We're the last generation of exile, the first generation of redemption. All we have to do is open our eyes. And what opens one's eyes through the light of Torah. Many years ago, in 1983, there was a young lad from South Africa, from Johannesburg, who suddenly was diagnosed by his ophthalmologist with terrible, debilitating eye disease. His uncle, who happened to have turned to Baltshuva, took him to the Rebbe, Hashanah Rabbah. The Rebbe gave a honey cake. And he had not written to the Rebbe about his diagnosis, never discussed it. But the Rebbe gave him a honey cake, and he said, a piece of honey cake, and he said, may the Almighty grant that you should be able to study Torah with open eyes. And needless to say, never again did this young man face any problems. And the moral of the story is that the light of Torah, especially learning Rambam, when we live in a generation of doubt and ambiguity, a lack of clarity, a lack of faith, it's the Rambam who opens our eyes, that unifies us, that body and soul, emotions, on all different levels, we become unified people. There's actually a very celebrated chassid, Ramesh Weber, who lived in Yerushalayim, and he told the story of a Sephardi couple. A woman gave birth to a child, and from birth, this child did not stop crying. They went to doctors, all kinds of doctors, to neurologists, to Rebbes, to Kabbalists, tried to get some peace. They couldn't sleep at night, but the